Today, on this episode of The Crossover, we will be discussing The Good Nurse, Capturing a Serial Killer, with Netflix actress, former registered nurse, and star of the movie The Good Nurse, Amy Loughren. Learn how this courageous woman recognized a cold-blooded murderer, aided law enforcement, and ended one of the deadliest killing sprees in U.S. history. Much more on this episode of The Crossover. Good afternoon, everyone. Going to be talking with Amy Loughren today, The Good Nurse. For any of you who haven't seen the movie on Netflix, The Good Nurse, based on a true story. Crazy, to be honest with you. So if you haven't seen it, definitely watch it. We'll be talking with the main person depicted in it. Amy, how you doing?
I am fantastic. I am still a little bit jet lagged from a month in Indonesia, but I think I'm
Well, that's awesome.
recovering
Yeah,
well.
I saw that you've been traveling a lot, and it's again, thanks for making time to talk to us today. Oh, well, of
Thank you
course. I
for
mean, your
inviting
story is
me.
riveting, and I'm just going to do a little background while everyone's logging on. For those of you who don't know Amy Loughren, she is best known for her assistance nearly, I guess it was 20 years ago, in the arrest of serial killer Charlie Cullen, who was a nurse who confessed to killing at least 30 people with lethal doses of inappropriate medications. As background, Cullen and Amy were friends who both worked in the ICU on the night shift back in Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey. In 2003, Loughren was approached by detectives who suspected that Cullen was poisoning hospital patients. As part of her investigation, she helped Cullen confess essentially over time, and we'll talk about how that went down, and really ended one of the deadliest serial killing sprees in U.S. history. And I think people don't really understand the magnitude of this, and I want to get into that as well. So again, Amy, welcome here today to discuss the amazing movie, The Good Nurse, ending Charlie Cullen's serial killing spree and all that you did. So pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you so
getting
much.
into a little bit of background, tell us about your friendship with Charlie, because the movie depicts it as you guys were both working on the night shift. He was certainly a confidant for you. And how did your friendship develop?
So our friendship developed because I was very drawn to his expertise. In real life, we worked together for about a year and a half. I think in the movie it's depicted that it was only a few months, but Charlie and I were very close, and he was just so smart, so funny. We were great teammates. He was always the person that was my go-to when I had a question. He was very shy, he was very quiet, and I'm very drawn to those types of people. He was very cerebral, and I like people that are smarter than me so that I can learn something, and he certainly was. What I didn't realize, of course, was that he seemed a lot smarter because he knew exactly what was going on with these patients that were coding. But I definitely confided in him. We were both single parents. We both had two daughters, and
And
we were
so
fast
on a daily
friends.
basis, no red flags for the first year and a half, nothing that you would suspect was off.
I never suspected him. I had so much guilt about that. And there were several times when I know that my 2020 vision, being able to look back, I do know that he murdered
Such a
people right in
crazy
front of
thought.
me.
And we'll get into how you've dealt with that over the years. But and the movie also talks about how you had cardiomyopathy and amazingly you've done so well. How did he help you with your cardiomyopathy?
Well, I was actually a travel nurse, so I worked on the weekends. I would come to the hospital, and I would arrive at the hospital on Fridays. I would stay in the hospital in the on-call rooms. So I would work 12, 16-hour shifts, go back to the on-call rooms and fall asleep. I would get onto the floor and we would hit the ground running, and I wouldn't realize that I did not bring my cardizem with me or whatever medications I was on at the time. And I would be in the middle of a code and I'm in rapid AFib at about 180 and I'm becoming syncopal. And there were several times when he pulled cardizem out of the Pyxis for me to take so that I
Wow.
was still able to work.
When was the first inkling that you had that something was off with Charlie?
Unfortunately, it was not until I was questioned by the detectives. Charlie had been fired, and about a week to 2 weeks after he was fired, the detectives showed up and they were asking very leading questions, not just about Charlie, but also about me. And they had some information that I was very close with him and that I was also the only person who had spoken to him since he was fired. So I did not know, I didn't even suspect. And in my investigation interview, when they asked me about Charlie, the lead detective, Danny Baldwin, he was able to secretively show me some of the evidence, and it was glaringly clear that Charlie was doing something
What was
sinister
that piece
behind
of
the
evidence?
scenes.
Can you say what cued you off?
So he showed me very quickly showed me some of the Pyxis printouts. And there were several entries in there that were so obvious. One of them was Nitropresside. And when we were on the night shift, occasionally we would have to, in code settings, hang nitride drips, and we would use these tiny little vials to reconstitute into a 250cc bag. And Charlie, multiple times on this, it showed he had pulled out 12 vials of nitropresside, and we would only use one tiny vial for 250 cc's. So there's no other reason that he would be pulling out those medications unless it was for
Give us some
something
details,
sinister.
because the movie goes into it a little bit, but how exactly was Charlie murdering these unsuspecting patients?
Well, he was definitely not a mercy killer. He had no interest in saving their lives. He had no interest in putting them out of their misery. He did have an interest in being a hero. However, he would play Russian roulette and he would inject our IV bags. We had our already medicated IV bags that were set out on the counters for our patients, and he would secretly be injecting them either with insulin, potassium, probably nitropresside. There were multiple medications and multiple cocktails that the detectives and I were able to see what he was using. Mostly it was a deadly cocktail, and the nurses on our unit would hang those for him. He would then go back in and discover the next day or during that shift, just from the lab work, who received those medications, and then sometimes those were the people that he ended up finishing off over the next couple of days. Other times he would directly use digoxin to just inject in them. He would also wake up the patients off of their Diprovan, and this was something that he never admitted to. It was a theory, because there were people that survived. He would wake them up off of their sedation and tell them that he was going to harm them, that he was going to kill them. So we know for certain he had no interest in making sure that these patients were put out of their misery. He also murdered people who were young. He murdered people who were ready to be discharged. You know, there really wasn't a set
Yeah, I mean, let's go
pattern
back
who
to that.
he
It
chose.
sounds totally random because the movie depicts, just like you said, he's injecting medications into these IV fluid bags, and just wherever those go, that's kind of random, right? So it wasn't like he would pick someone to murder. He would just say, I wonder who's going to be murdered today, essentially.
All we could do truly was theorize that it was random, because Charlie never really talked about that to me. I know that in his confession to the detectives, he did give more detailed accounts. However, the amount of people that he attempted murder, the numbers of successful murders could be in upwards of 400. The only reason that he was convicted for such a low number is that they still had to prove it. And also, he was really only admitting to murdering those people that he could remember specific details, that what he did truly murdered those people, and it wasn't some other, whether it was a system, you know, organic system failure within the patient because they were ill. So 30-ish people? No, it's
Such a
probably closer to
staggering number.
400.
So this guy was doing it for obviously many
Mm-hmm.
years, several hundred patients. What was the sentinel event that triggered law enforcement, and how did that investigation unfold?
It's hard to say what really triggered it. There was a whistleblower. And what we do know is that the hospital knew specifically, unequivocally, who was murdering patients and that patients were being murdered. And they then gave the wrong name to the detectives to throw them off the case. And after the hospital knew that he was murdering people, they did not fire him. They did not take him out of the ICU. And he murdered between 5 and 8 people after they knew
All right,
that
so let's
he
get
was
into that,
murdering
because
people.
that's really the crux of this entire interview, is that we see it not only with nurses but with doctors. We see doctors that are incompetent, multiple complications. I mean, Dr. Death is
Yep.
obviously a perfect example of a doctor counterpart to Nurse Cullen. But why do these hospitals essentially keep information from authorities, lie, and try to protect that entity? Because that was very clearly depicted in the movie. Why do hospitals do that?
You know, to me, there has to be some type of moral compass failure within the individual, because the risk manager, Mary Lund, who was depicted in the movie as Linda, Mary Lund knew that Charlie had been murdering people, and she went out of her way to protect the hospital. Her job was to be a risk manager. That is, a risk manager is not for decreasing risks to the patients. It is to decrease the risk to the hospital's bottom line. And that is what capitalism does in healthcare facilities, is that it puts us in line with monetizing off of people's suffering. And that breeds a whole new generation of ridiculousness with mental health illness. I can't imagine that these people at the top that made those decisions did not have something mentally wrong with them, along with Charles Cullen, because if you have a moral compass, that you have an emotional value system that you cannot go against, I could not ever have been convinced to cover up anything that came my way. I cannot understand how they did it. If I was in Mary Lunn's shoes, it would not matter that I was going to lose my job. I would have screamed it from the rooftops. So it always comes down to the individual. Yes, there's a system in place that protects the hospital, but bottom line is, so it's the individual.
You know, again, I'm going to combine your situation with Dr. Death. In both situations, there were never criminal proceedings against any of the hospitals, either in Dallas with Dr. Death, even though there were 4 or 5 hospitals that clearly knew he was maiming people and just got rid of him. In your situation, same thing happened. Like you said, the risk manager knows the nurse is killing patients and they're not essentially getting prosecuted. How do we change the system?
Well, I know that holding individuals accountable doesn't work. And even holding corporations accountable, because that's really what hospitals are, it doesn't work, because we are not focusing on the emotional and mental health of healthcare workers. And also, I believe that we need nurses making those decisions about ICUs, about ERs, we need nurses who were at the bedside making those decisions, and not a CFO and not a CEO, not a business person, but someone who has been a caregiver. And I also believe that that is what changed from when I started in nursing in the 80s. It was nurses that ran the hospital. It was the physicians, physicians like yourself that were running the hospitals, who really did genuinely care about these patients. So I think that system, this capitalistic system, unfortunately, I don't see a big change.
You said it fast. We basically lost track that patients are our first priority, and the people in charge are not clinicians, and so their first priority is always going to be financial. But anyway, obviously a major problem. Yeah. So I wanted to get into your emotional state, because the movie really kind of depicts what you went through. Tell us a little bit about your thought process and your emotions as you realized, like you said, when they showed you those Pyxis records, when you realized that one of your best friends was a serial killer. Take us through that thought process.
You know, it wasn't just, it's been 20 years and I still get emotional thinking about that moment, because Charlie was one of my best friends. And it wasn't just that I was afraid for my patients. I also felt so just sad for him, that he had such mental health issues and no one helped him. And I didn't see it either. I did not see it. So I was feeling for him. I was in the middle of my own challenges in life. And I really, it was just such a paradigm shift, to go from feeling like this is just like an everyday life to all of a sudden being thrust into this, it was like being in a detective novel. I was afraid for my job. I was afraid for my career. And at the time I had deadly electrical cardiomyopathy. I was waiting to be able to take time off to be able to even be able to be treated for this. I was exhausted working ICU. I was a single mom. Like, there was so much going on emotionally with me that I didn't know whether my health could even tolerate the stress of it. And then to make the decision to help the detectives, knowing that it could affect me physically, I didn't want to leave my children behind. So the decision to help them was not an easy one. It wouldn't have been an easy one for anyone, but my situation specifically, I had so many stressors at that time, and also no one was helping me take care of my emotional health either. So it was a real struggle. On the other hand, I also had this intense need to put things right. I knew that I hadn't seen the signs. I knew that it was me that could have stopped it sooner if I had seen the signs, and I needed to put that right. And I also needed to make sure that there weren't any more victims ever again at the hand of Charles Cullen. And I really, at that time, I would have done anything to make sure that that
Did
never happened
you
again.
feel like you or your kids were ever at risk from the time that you realized he was a serial killer and he was fired? Because the movie depicts you coming home, he's there with your kids. There's a sense of, you're like, there's a serial killer in my house with my kids. So were you ever fearful?
So that was Hollywood. Charlie never did actually come to my home. Christy Wilson Cairns, who was the screenplay writer, did such a beautiful job with that. And I'm actually glad that she put that in the movie, because it did show how close Charlie and I were. If I did live closer to the hospital, Charlie would have been at my home. And I think that it gave people a better sense, because it's so hard in a 2-hour movie to really give people a really a glimpse into what our life really was like together. And it's also hard for people to understand just how close healthcare workers get when they are trauma bonded. And when you become like soldiers, and we were that close that, yes, I would have trusted him with my children. So
We lost your call.
back to your question, I really felt like after my wearing a wire, when I went into the restaurant with him, I wore a wire. And when I realized that I did not get enough of a confession out of him, and also after he did confess to me in that restaurant while I was wearing a wire, the wire malfunctioned. So we did not, it was going to end up being my word against his. And I also didn't realize that they had arrested him. So it was at that point that I did fear for my children's lives, and I did call and have them move to a different location so that he wouldn't even have an opportunity to do something to me or the
How
girls.
difficult was it to get him to confess? Again, the movie, it's not completely accurate, right? Because that confession happened when he was basically, already arrested. Is that where it happened, or was it at the diner? How did you get him to confess?
So at the restaurant, he confessed, although it wasn't a, I injected someone. It was that he said he wanted to go down fighting. He did not want his daughters to believe that he was a monster, and he did not want to say the words. He did confess, but it wasn't word for word that I did this. So they did arrest him, and then 2 days later, they brought me back in because that wire had malfunctioned, and they really needed an actual confession out of him. So I spent hours with him, talking with him, and really trying to help him understand that he was going to drag me and his daughters through some horrible, horrible situations, and that he could still be my hero. And he also believed that I may be implicated in these murders. That wasn't going to happen, but I believe the detectives did give him that indication. So he did confess
Wow,
to
it's really
protect me.
powerful. Um, in your opinion, if you had not gotten involved, if you had not cooperated with the authorities, how many more people could Charlie have killed?
What I know is that he was already ready to, he had already been hired for another position, so he was going to start working again. He also has admitted that he wouldn't have stopped if I hadn't stopped him. Now, of course, with the detectives and all of the work that they did, you know, it was an insane amount of work that they had to do to get him behind bars. I just was able to give them that definitive, obvious, he's going to stay in prison, and it's going to be a lot easier because now he has confessed. Would they have been able to prove everything without his confession? I believe they were on that path to be able to do that. I think it made it much easier to make sure that he stayed behind bars because he confessed, and then he did cooperate with
So
their
let me ask you the
investigation.
million-dollar question. Why do you think he was a serial killer?
It started very early on. I know that his family did tell Charles Graeber, who was the brilliant author of the book The Good Nurse. He did a decade's worth of research into Charles Cullen. And after his interviews with the family, it was obvious that his murderous tendencies started before he was even a teenager. So he had tried to harm or kill one of his sister's boyfriends. I believe he was only 9 when that happened. So whatever occurred very young. And being a serial killer, I believe it was just a high for him. I think he was obsessed with killing, and the medical profession just gave him the perfect medium to really
Now I'm going to
feed
ask
that
a scary
compulsion.
question in the sense that the movie depicts, and I think it's pretty accurate, that Charlie was able to pull this off fairly easily. Do you think this is happening elsewhere? And how can we prevent this from occurring in the future?
There's a couple of things with Charlie that we could have caught him much earlier. And like I said, I had one short, less than 30-second look at that Pixis printout, and I knew he was murdering people. So they were not paying attention to the Pixis. They were not. They were not paying attention to the medications. I do believe that if there are algorithmic type of systems in place to really patternize what healthcare workers are taking out, or what type of patterns they have with going into patients' rooms, and the way that they document, there were definitely signs of what was happening with him. And I do believe that with AI now, we would be able to come up with something to at least give us a risk analysis and an algorithm to stop it. Do I think that it's still happening? I do. However, those people are in the minority. What is happening in healthcare now is much more dangerous than what Charles Cullen was doing. And that is the fact that nursing and medicine is just not a sustainable career anymore. It's just not. We're working so short, and especially after COVID, we are not taking care of the mental health of our nurses nurses, of our frontline workers. And I think that is what can really help in any situation, whether it's, you know, the extreme of Charles Cullen or just the everyday that, you know, I needed more emotional support. I needed better health care. And I think that that is where
How
we
has
can
this
start.
horrific event changed you as a human being?
I went on a very, very deep spiritual quest after this happened, because I really genuinely thought that I would have seen a monster right in front of me, and I didn't. So with that spiritual quest, I have been able to trust people even more and love people even deeper, and come to the conclusion that Charles Cullen is behind bars because someone adored him, not because someone wanted to punish him. And that care and that love that I felt for him inevitably was what allowed him the safety to be able to confess to those crimes. So I really feel that being able to connect with healthcare workers and be an advocate for mental health for healthcare workers is where my strength is right now. And I'm appreciative of
You know,
that
listen, Amy,
opportunity.
what a fantastic interview. I just want to wrap up by going over 3 points that I think were very highlighted. Number one, kudos to you for your strength, getting through, working with authorities, having him confess, and ending what is arguably the deadliest killing spree in U.S. history. And you're responsible for that. So again, congratulations, and so proud of what you went through. Number two, I
Thank
think
you.
the movie and this situation highlights the problems that we have with our current medical system, how doctors and nurses a lot of times are not held accountable, and the hospitals aren't held accountable. And I think that needs to change. And finally, mental health, which is what is obviously a huge deal in this country. And this story only highlights it more. Someone who you trusted, who you had no idea was so perturbed. And so I do think we need to spend more time focusing on mental health for all of our healthcare workers, and especially the nurses. So again, thank you for your time. Unbelievable story. If anyone hasn't seen it, The Good Nurse on Netflix, unreal. Watch it. Again, Amy, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you
Take care
so
and have a
much.
great day. All right. Be well.